Hello everybody. Welcome to Daily News Simplified, an answer to what, why and how of newspaper reading. In today's edition, we'll be discussing the New Delhi edition of the Hindu newspaper dated 12th December 2019. Now this discussion will be taken up in two parts. The first one will be taken up by me and the second one will be taken up by Nagendra sir. So let's start. Now, this article relates to the recent enumeration of India's foreign policy by the External Affairs Minister in the backdrop of the 4th Ramnath Goenka lecture, in which the External Affairs Minister drew upon the broad contours of Indian foreign policy today, in that he outlined the Indian foreign policy into two parts, one in which he enumerates the evolution of India's foreign policy under 6 different phases, and two in which he identifies the major issues that should guide the India's foreign policy under 5 baskets. Now, besides taking note of the rapid changes in the changing global scenario, the External Affairs Minister emphasizes the need for a constant change in the outlook of India's foreign policy, in that he admits that the real obstacle for rise of India in the global stage is not so much the barriers of the world, but the dogmas of Delhi, that is commonly being called now as the Delhi Dogma. Now, in this context, this article appears as a lead article on page number 10, under which the author is of the opinion that the Jaishankar doctrine, highlighting the mistakes of the past, is ideologically biased, in that he calls this doctrine a Delhi Dogma fallacy of the right for its ideological bias. Now, in this context, this article becomes important from the perspective of General Studies Paper 2 under the subsection. Now, before we understand this article, let us have a look at what is Jaishankar doctrine in the framework of the evolution of Indian foreign policy under 6 phases, and the most important issues under 5 different baskets that guide the Indian foreign policy today. Now, coming to the evolution of India's foreign policy, the External Affairs Minister divides the evolution under 6 phases. The first phase is between 1946 and 62 in what he calls as the era of optimistic non-alignment. Now, as you must be well aware that in the aftermath of Second World War, the world was divided into two poles led by US and USSR in what is commonly called as the bipolar world, in which backdrop India adopted a policy of non-alignment, as sovereignty was the most important goal for India in the aftermath of colonization. In addition, with national integrity and economic development as its primary goals, India acted as the leader of the decolonized nations and worked towards a more equitable world order under the policy of non-alignment. Now, the period between 1962 to 1971 is what the External Affairs Minister calls as the era of limited cooperation, in that India aligned with USA initially and thereafter with Russia in the aftermath of Tashkent Agreement. Now, a brief look at the background of the period reveals that this was the period we fought the war with China. Besides, domestically, we were also facing with acute food shortages and the consequent economic distress. Now, here he highlights that India, learning from the mistakes that was done in the first phase with lack of attention to security, in the second phase, India made a pragmatic choice on focusing on security, in that India signed a defense cooperation agreement with the United States as early as 1964. Besides, as you must be aware, the 1965 war with Pakistan led to mounting pressure from both United States and USSR to end violence in Kashmir, which culminated in the signing of what is popularly called as the Tashkent Agreement in 1966. Now, as a result, this phase, is seen as an era of limited cooperation, in that India for the first time gave importance to security when it signed the 1964 Defense Cooperation Agreement with United States, and later the cooperation with USSR in the aftermath of Tashkent Agreement in 1966 in signing of what is called as Indo-Soviet Union Friendship Treaty. Now, coming to the third phase, between 1971 and 1991, the External Affairs Minister calls this period as an era of greater regional assertion, in that identifying the role of India in creation of Bangladesh, also India's role in sending the international peacekeeping force in Sri Lanka to tackle the LTTE issue. Now, this was also a period when there emerged a US-China-Pakistan axis, which led to India naturally leaning towards USSR and adoption by India a more pro-Soviet Union position on international issues. Now, in the aftermath of the dissolution of USSR, the next phase is classified as an era of strategic autonomy between 1991 to 2000. Now, this was the period which saw the emergence of unipolar world with the dissolution of USSR. Accordingly, India adopted the policy of safeguarding the strategic autonomy besides opening up the economy through the LPG reforms. Now, having opened up the economy, the next phase between 2000 to 2014 saw India emerge as a balancing power in the world stage. Now, this period, as it is well known, saw the emergence of China and a multipolar world in which India adopted for multiple engagements, as India emerged as the balancing power in the global stage. Now, this emerging power of India during this period is reflected in the fact that India signed a nuclear deal with United States in 2005. Now, at the same time, in line with its policy of multiple engagement, India also makes common cause with China on issues of climate change and trade negotiations. Now, this is also the period in which India has also consolidated its ties with Russia. Besides, in multilateral forums like BRICS, India's role is extremely important. Now, thus, the India's approach during this phase is multiple engagements playing a balancing power in the multipolar world. Now, before we look into the sixth phase, which is currently ongoing since 2014, let us look at the critique of Indian foreign policy according to the Jaishankar doctrine in the first 5 phases. Now, according to the Jaishankar doctrine, the first phase constituted a phase in which the emphasis was given more to diplomacy and thus ignoring the hard realities of the security situation in the subcontinent. Now, this led to India being underprepared for security situations, as was seen in the 1962 war with China. Now, besides, he also highlights that Indian foreign policy failed to secure the borders with Pakistan during the Shimla Agreement, leading to prolonging of the security situation across POK, which is continuing till date. Now, besides, the policy of self-reliance led to what is known as BOP crisis and consequent economic stagnation in 1991, which is also highlighted as a foreign policy failure. Now, besides, the minister also highlights the missed opportunity to resolve the border dispute with China in 1960 when the Chinese president Zhou Enlai visited India. Now, having admitted the mistakes of Indian foreign policy during the first 5 phases, now let us look at the 6th phase that is ongoing since 2014. Now, a look at the geopolitics today reveals the fact that there is weakening multilateralism that is reflected in growing protectionism, as in case of US, Brexit, etc. Now, today, China is emerging as one of the global powers. Besides, climate change is an additional factor that is contributing to geopolitics today. The demography and the economics of Africa is giving a greater salience to the region. Besides, in the changed global scenario, technology, connectivity, and trade are at the heart of new contestations as identified in the Jaishankar doctrine. Now, given the changing geopolitical landscape, India's approach has been multiple engagement, in that it has engaged both with US and China. It is continuing a steady relationship with Russia. Now, Japan has become an important factor in India's foreign policy calculus. Now, France has emerged as a strategic partner. Now, India's focus in development assistance in Africa is increasing. Besides, in pursuance with its neighborhood first policy, India's investment in the neighborhood is at unprecedented levels today. Now, coming to the most important issues that should guide India's foreign policy, the Jaishankar Doctrine puts these issues under 5 baskets, namely security, economics, multiple strategic engagement, risk taking, and realistic assessment of the geopolitics. Now, under security, the Jaishankar Doctrine advocates for what is known as greater realism, which is displayed in the recent setting up of Chief of Defense Staff, which reflects that India is engaging more with military along with diplomacy, which was the lacuna in the first phase, as we have mentioned. Now, besides, India has signed 2+2 dialogues with a number of countries, including US, Japan, and Australia, which reflects the importance of engaging military along with diplomacy. In addition, unlike the 2611, we have now reacted to the recent attacks, which has led to India forming smaller battlefield formations like integrated battle groups with limited objectives. Besides, India is also focusing on enhancing its maritime domain awareness, reflecting a greater realism to harsh realities of security in the changing global scenario. Now, identifying the second basket as economics, the Jaishankar Doctrine highlights that a common feature of all the success stories, whether it is China or the other Asian tigers like Singapore and Taiwan, is that they leveraged the global environment for their economic development in what is called as the export-led growth strategy. Now, in order to leverage the global environment, India should leverage its free trade agreements that is currently mostly deficit ridden. In order to turn around the trade deficits, India should adopt structural reforms in its domestic supply chain. This is especially true in case of ASEAN markets. Besides, we should move away from the old dogmas of self-reliance and import substitution in order to leverage the global markets. Now, the next of the issues the document highlights is multiple strategic engagement in a multipolar world, which also calls for risk taking, which is an inherent aspect of diplomacy, and a realistic assessment of geopolitics, which should include a proper understanding of the US China contradictions, weak multilateralism, and thereby greater space for regional powers like India, which should look for a number of convergences like that it has done with Japan. Thus, in conclusion, the Jaishankar Doctrine highlights the importance of moving away from the independent mindset that drove the non-alignment strategy. Rather, what we need today is protect our strategic equities that is better expressed in multiple partnerships in a multipolar world of convergence today. Now, this coverage of the Jaishankar Doctrine under 6 phases and 5 baskets is aimed at giving you a framework to analyze different foreign relations of India today. Now, having understood this doctrine, let us see the criticism to this doctrine as highlighted by the author in this article. Now, as I have already mentioned, the author describes the Jaishankar's assessment of India's foreign policy as ideologically biased, which is having an advantage of being able to look things from a hindsight, which is in turn being promoted as pragmatism. Besides, the author also highlights that the non-alignment was the need of the time given the horrors of colonialism in the aftermath of independence. Besides, the doctrine highlights broader approach rather than providing specific solutions to issues. Now, in addition, the doctrine also fails to admit that there was no outcome in the recent engagements like Howdy Modi or Chennai Connect, or even for that matter, the Quad grouping. Now, besides, the author also highlights the biggest disappointment of the Jaishankar Doctrine with respect to Kashmir issue. Taking the Kashmir issue to UN in the aftermath of independence was a mistake, and instead advocates that India could have liberated the princely state of Jammu and Kashmir from Pakistani invasion during 1947-48. However, according to the author, what the Jaishankar Doctrine misses is that at the point of time, when Indian and Pakistani army was still commanded by the British officers, it might not have been possible for India to forcibly get the rest of Jammu and Kashmir, and therefore going to UN was the next best option, which it did. Now, thus, internationalization of Kashmir issue was rather a compulsion for India at the time as opposed to a failure in foreign policy as highlighted by the Jaishankar doctrine. Now, the importance of this news analysis is with respect to the mains examination, in that the Jaishankar doctrine, within the framework of 6 phases of evolution and 5 baskets, gives you a framework to analyze the broad contours of Indian foreign policy and the thinking in the current dispensation to guide the foreign policy today. Now, with this, let's move to the next news. Now, amidst widespread opposition, the Rajya Sabha finally cleared the contentious Citizenship Amendment Bill 2019, which extends citizenship to illegal migrants of minority communities from Afghanistan, Bangladesh, and Pakistan, in particular to the migrants belonging to minority communities in these countries, including Hindus, Sikhs, Buddhists, Jains, Parsis, and Christians. Now, in this context, this article appears on multiple pages, including the headline on page number 1, and becomes important from the perspective of both General Studies Paper 1 under the subsection Regionalism and General Studies Paper 2 under the subsection Citizenship. Now, while the basics of this bill has been covered comprehensively in the DNS analysis of 1st December 2019 by Vaibhav sir, in this news analysis, we will do a quick recap of the Citizenship Amendment Bill and focus more on the issues that have been raised with respect to this contentious bill. Now, as you must be aware, the Citizenship Amendment Bill 2019 amends the Citizenship Amendment Act of 1955 to provide for citizenship to illegal migrants of minority communities from Afghanistan, Bangladesh, and Pakistan. The migrants belonging to minority communities include the Hindus, the Sikhs, the Buddhists, Jains, Parsis, and Christians from these countries who have entered India on or before 31st December 2014. Besides, the Act also provides for fast tracking of Indian citizenship, in that it provides for citizenship by naturalization in 6 years against the original requirement of minimum residence of 12 years. Besides, the bill also proposes to incorporate a subsection to section 7 providing for cancellation of OCI registrations where the OCI card holder has violated any provision of the Citizenship Act or any law in general. Now, as you must be aware, Part 2 of the Constitution, including Articles 5 to 11, deal with the citizenship in India. Accordingly, Indian Citizenship Act of 1955 was enacted, which deals exhaustively with the provisions relating to citizenship. Now, according to Indian Citizenship Act of 1955, one can become a citizen of India in the following ways, including citizenship by birth, citizenship by descent, citizenship by registration, and finally citizenship by naturalization, which is the relevant provision with respect to the Citizenship Amendment Bill of 2019. The bill also provides for certain exception in that it excludes areas under 6th schedule of the Constitution and some northeastern states that are covered under the inner line permit regime. Now, the states that have been excluded are Arunachal Pradesh, Mizoram, most of Nagaland, Meghalaya, and Tripura, and certain tribal pockets of Assam. Besides, the bill also excludes the state of Manipur after widespread opposition against the bill. Now, while the basic provisions of the Citizenship Amendment Bill has been covered in detail in the DNS analysis of 1st December 2019, I would suggest you to go through the same. Now, here, let us analyze the issues that have been arised as a result of passing of this bill. Now, the first and the most contentious among the issues against the passing of the bill is from Assam and Tripura, which is vehemently opposing the bill on account of re-emergence of outsider versus insider debate of 1970s in Assam. Further, the sections of the population in Assam fears that since the Citizenship Amendment Bill does not apply to the adjoining tribal areas, there will be large-scale migration of Bengali migrants to Assam, thereby largely affecting its demography. Now, given the plurality of population in Assam, it represents an ethnicity based imbalance based on exploitation of resources from outsiders, leading to a wider spread insider versus outsider debate since time immemorial. As you must be aware, the Brahmaputra Valley of Assam is dominated by the Assamese speaking populace, and the Kachar region is dominated by the Bengali speaking populace. Now, given the plurality of this population, Assam has witnessed two distinct phases of regionalism, one over the issue of language during 1962 and another during 1970s, which took the color of Son of Soil movement in Assam. Now, this Son of Soil movement in the 1970s was as a result of educational and economic backwardness of the Assamese speaking people who saw domination of Bengali speaking population who occupied higher position in the administration, business, law, etc. in the Assam society. Thus, in the aftermath of 1970s, regionalism in Assam has mostly targeted Bengali-speaking migrant population from Bangladesh. Now, the Citizenship Amendment Bill, which provides for extension of citizenship to Hindu illegal migrants from Bangladesh, has raised fears in Assam that the Supreme Court monitored NRC, which seeks to exclude the illegal immigrants from Assam, will be rendered toothless. Besides, Assam also fears that since the Citizenship Amendment Bill does not apply to the adjoining tribal areas of Arunachal Pradesh, Manipur, Mizoram, and Nagaland, there could be large-scale migration of the Bengali Hindu immigrants inhabiting the region to Assam and thereby affecting its demography. Now, the widespread agitation, particularly in Assam, that you see is primarily on account of the re-emergence of the outsider versus insider debate in Assam. Now, besides, there is also opposition to the bill on the grounds that it discriminates based on the country of origin. In that, the naysayers say why the migrants from Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Bangladesh are differentiated from other neighboring countries, including Sri Lanka and Myanmar, which also have had persecution based on religion in case of Rohingyas in Myanmar, and also the Tamil Elams of Sri Lanka having faced the persecution based on language that have sought refuge in India from time immemorial. Now, given that the objective of the bill is to provide for citizenship to migrants escaping from religious persecution, it is not clear that why the migrants belonging to religious minorities from Myanmar have been excluded from the bill. Besides, it is also argued that there are some religious minorities in Pakistan, for instance, who have faced religious persecution and may have illegally migrated to India, for example, the Ahmadiyya Muslims of Pakistan. Now, the criticism in this case is that it is unclear why these illegal migrants, in this instance the Ahmadiyya Muslims, have not been included in the bill despite being persecuted on the basis of religion in the country of their origin. Lastly, there is also widespread opposition to the wide discretion the bill provides to the executive to cancel OCI registrations in case of violation of any law. Now, the Citizenship Amendment Bill 2019 provides for cancellation of OCI registrations if an OCI has violated any law notified by the central government and thus leaves a lot of arbitrariness in the hands of executive. Therefore, as we have seen, the contentious issues with respect to the Citizenship Amendment Bill revolve around these issues relating to the insider versus outsider debate in the Northeast, particularly Assam, discrimination based on country of origin, in that the reason for exclusion of minorities from Sri Lanka and Myanmar is unclear. The exclusion of the Ahmadiyya Muslims from Pakistan is also seen as discrimination. Now, thus, these discriminations are seen as violation of Article 14 of the Constitution. Besides, by amending the provision to cancel OCI registration, the bill provides for arbitrary power to the executive and thus it is being vehemently opposed. Now, with this, let's move to the next news. Now, in a significant move that will remove the final hurdle for companies that take over the stressed firms, the Union Cabinet has approved a key amendment to the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code, protecting the successful bidders against the criminal offences committed by the previous promoters. Now, in this context, this article appears on page number 15 and becomes important from the perspective of General Studies Paper 3 under the section Economic Development. Now, in order to understand the significance of this amendment, let us take a look at an insolvency proceeding scenario. Under the current Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code, the asset of a stressed firm is resolved as a result of a bidder taking over the stressed assets. Now, once the stressed asset is resolved, if for some reasons the criminal offences of the promoter comes into light, currently some of the investigation agencies like Enforcement Directorate, CBI, etc. could attach the property that was resolved under the insolvency procedure. However, this acted as a major hurdle for smooth insolvency procedure as it would discourage the bidders from taking over the stressed assets. Now, for example, the ArcelorMittal, which had successfully bid for Essar Steel through the insolvency process, had sought for such an immunity from any future investigation pertaining to the company for the criminal offences of the erstwhile promoters who were the Ruia family. Now, through the amendment to the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code, this second amendment bill seeks to prohibit attaching of companies resolved under the mechanism for offences committed by the previous promoters. Now, besides, the amendment is also made relating to a provision that sought to protect the home buyers that was passed recently. Now, it should be noted that originally the IBC did not have any protection for home buyers in case of a default by real estate developers. Now, subsequently, in order to protect the home buyers, the amendment was made treating the home buyers as a creditor in case of insolvency proceedings. Now, however, it should be noted that under this amendment, even a single home buyer having a claim of more than 1 lakh rupees was treated as a financial creditor for insolvency purposes. Now, as a result, concerns were raised by the real estate developers with respect to some of the home buyers misusing such a provision, leading to undue delay in the pending housing projects. Now, as a result, the Cabinet has approved the new amendment that is aimed to address this misuse by the home buyers, in that the single home buyer after the amendment would not be able to invoke insolvency proceedings against the real estate developer. Now, having understood the key amendments to the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code, let us look at a brief background to Insolvency Bankruptcy Code. Now, the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code was passed by the Parliament in 2016 to devise a mechanism to settle failed or bankrupt entities through a speedy insolvency procedure. Now, earlier there were multiple laws dealing with the financial failure and insolvency of companies in India, which led to undue delay in the recovery of non-performing assets by the banks. Now, in order to consolidate these laws and provide for a clear, coherent and speedy process for identification and resolution of financial distress of companies and individuals, the Parliament had enacted the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code of 2016. Now, the procedure that was provided under Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code is as seen in this figure. Now, under the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code, if a company defaults on repayment either to its financial creditors like banks and financial institutions or operational creditors like suppliers, the insolvency resolution can be initiated either by the debtor, which is the company itself, or the creditors, including banks and suppliers of the defaulting company. Now, once the resolution process is initiated, either by debtor or creditor, the resolution is taken up by the adjudicating authority, which is NCLT or National Companies Law Tribunal for companies, and Debt Recovery Tribunal in case the default is on part of the individual. Now, the adjudicating authority in turn appoints an insolvency professional in order to administer the insolvency resolution process, in that the insolvency professional identifies the financial creditors and constitutes what is called as a committee of creditors, who in turn have two options: either to restructure the firm if it is viable through a resolution plan, or liquidate the firm in case the firm is financially not viable. Now, besides, it should be noted that the resolution plan so prepared shall be approved by at least 66% of the votes in the committee of creditors, failing which the firm would go for liquidation on account of unviable financial distress of the company. Now, besides, the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code also provided for an institutional mechanism for insolvency in India, in that it provided for insolvency professionals who are a specialized cadre of individuals who conduct insolvency resolution process, take over the management of the stressed company, assist the creditors in collection of relevant information, and also manage the liquidation process if the stressed company goes for liquidation. Besides, the code also provided for insolvency professional agencies which will examine and certify these insolvency professionals. Besides, as mentioned earlier, the code also provides for adjudicating authorities, which is NCLT in case of companies and debt recovery tribunals in case of individuals. Besides, the code also provides for a regulator to oversee the new entities that are set up under the code, which is known as Insolvency and Bankruptcy Board. Besides, in order to decide whether to restructure a debt through a resolution plan or liquidate the asset in case of unviable financial distress, the code also provided for a committee of creditors who are responsible for preparation of resolution plan under the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code. Now, with this, let's move to the next news. Now, in accordance with a study conducted by the Central Water Commission, about 65% of the samples of water taken by various water stations in the country reported heavy metal contamination. Now, in this context, this article appears on page number 9 under the title Heavy Metals Contaminating India's Rivers, and becomes important from the perspective of both a preliminary and mains examination under the head Environmental Pollution and Degradation and General Issues relating to environmental ecology. Now, this study by Central Water Commission has highlighted that iron has emerged as the most common contaminant. Besides, it is also noted that none of the sites registered arsenic levels above the safe limit. In addition, the contaminants are seasonal in nature, in that lead, cadmium, nickel, chromium and copper were more common in the non-monsoon periods. On the other hand, iron contamination, lead contamination, chromium and copper contamination were more common in the monsoon periods. Now, having looked at the key highlights of the report, let us look at some of the concerns, the main sources and the way forward in tackling heavy metal contamination of Indian rivers. Now, while the presence of metal in drinking water to some extent is required for good health, when they are found above the safe limits, they are associated with a range of disorders. In that, the long-term exposure of heavy metal may lead to physical, muscular and neurological degenerative processes, including Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, muscular dystrophy and multiple sclerosis. Now, besides, since majority of Indians still use water directly from the rivers for their domestic use, there is an increasing pressure on these rivers with increase in population, which severely affects the health of the rivers. Now, besides, the concentration of such toxic metals have increased rapidly over past few decades, resulting in soil contamination and consequent contamination of crops and vegetables that have grown on this soil. Now, as a result of non-biodegradability and bioaccumulation, these heavy metals is extremely toxic to humans and environment. Now, the main sources of heavy metal contamination of this river include mining, milling, plating and surface finishing industries, industrial waste, sanitary landfills, fossil fuel combustion and agricultural runoff. Now, having highlighted the key concerns and the main sources of heavy metal contamination, the report also recommends some of the measures that are to be taken in order to tackle the heavy metal contamination, which includes effective monitoring, in that the report prescribes monitoring of quality of water at least 4 times a year. Besides, the report also points out that all toxic metals like chromium and other associated heavy metals coming from the tanneries, mines, and other industries should be treated chemically and biologically before such wastes find their way to water. In addition, the report also highlights the importance of effective implementation of water pollution control regulation in the country. Now, while these aspects may be important from the perspective of mains examination, we have compiled a list of pollutants and associated diseases in the PDF that is given below, which may be used as a ready primer from the perspective of prelims examination.
We have taken this news from page number 15, and it talks about a very important topic which deals about partial credit scheme. Now, recently, the Government of India has approved partial credit guarantee scheme for the benefit of banks as well as NBFCs. Now, the basic idea behind such partial credit guarantee scheme is to help in injecting more liquidity in the economy. As we all are aware that Indian economy has shown the signs of slowdown, and in such a scenario, it is very important to increase credit supply in the market. Moreover, it will also give a new leash of life for the NBFCs. The current system of operations for NBFCs has many problems. One of the problem which relates to the operation of NBFCs is that they take money in the form of short term and they lend money in infrastructure projects. Now we all know that when money is borrowed on short term basis and money is lent to infrastructure projects, then there will be a mismatch in terms of payment timing. And hence, some measure is required to ensure that NBFCs operate smoothly. For this purpose, let's take a help of the diagram. Now let's deal with the problem at hand. The problem is with non-banking financial corporations which have a unique style of working. Now, in terms of generating money, these NBFCs use commercial papers and they borrow using commercial papers which are of short term duration. Now, when we talk about short term borrowing, it means the period of repayment is less than 1 year. So, this is the nature of the commercial papers that NBFCs use for borrowing money. So, they do short term borrowing and the borrowing is short term, it means the borrowing is for less than 1 year. At the same time, when the NBFCs are lending money, they lend money to the infrastructure projects which are a type of long-term loans. Now we know that infrastructure projects have long gestation period and at the same time the rate of interest is low. Moreover, when we talk about short-term loan through commercial papers, the rate of interest is high. So this in turn leads to a crisis in non-banking financial corporations. And this crisis can be called as poor credit creation. And this poor credit creation leads to asset liability mismatch. We hope that this mismatch is clear to you because they borrow money which is in the short term perspective, they lend money which is in the long term perspective. At the same time, interest rate for commercial papers of short term would be high, and at the same time, since they invest in infrastructure projects, they will have low rate of return on an average. So this is actually leads to poor credit creation. And once we have got into this cycle, this leads to slowdown in the economy. So NBFCs are facing problem in this case, and this problem leads to the slowdown in the economy. At the same time, when NBFCs are borrowing, even in the form of commercial papers, then banks are involved. And if by any reasons NBFCs are not in a position to service the loan that they have taken, then banks are also in a problem because this credit crunch will lead to change in the situation of the NPAs for the banks as well. So, in a nutshell, it can be said that NBFCs are facing a credit crunch, and this credit crunch is caused by asset liability mismatch. And this asset liability mismatch is caused by the kind of borrowing that they have done, which is of short term, and the lending that they have done, which is of long term duration. So, this actually leads to asset liability mismatch. Now, the poor financial condition of NBFCs has adversely affected the credit creation in the economy. And in this regard, the Union Budget of 2019 has announced partial credit guarantee scheme. Now, the article basically talks about the changes that Government of India has incorporated about the partial credit guarantee scheme. But before understanding the concept in terms of the change that is incorporated by the government, we need to understand what is partial guarantee scheme. Now, let us understand the partial credit guarantee scheme, which was mentioned in the budget as well. Now, as far as this scheme is concerned, the public sector banks or PSBs will be in a position to buy highly rated assets of NBFCs and HFCs. So, the important aspect is only those assets which are highly rated will be bought by the PSBs. This will in turn bring infusion of liquidity in the NBFCs and HFCs, and in this process, slowdown can be reversed. At the same time, there is one more thing, that the limit for the PSBs is to buy assets up to rupees 1 lakh crore only. So the banks cannot buy assets more than 1 lakh crore. Now the government's role comes in the second part. Once the PSB has bought assets from NBFCs or HFCs, and in case these assets turn out to be non performing assets, then in that case, the government guarantees that it will take the responsibility of 10,000 crores as a security against those assets. So, in this way, we can understand that this is the maximum limit of the support which the government would give to the assets bought by the PSBs, which in turn become, say, NPAs. Now, this is where the entire situation was. So, this was partial credit guarantee scheme in which the NBFCs were getting liquidity by selling high rated assets to PSBs, and in this turn, PSB will supply money back to the NBFCs, and in this case, the credit crunch will be removed. The government wants to have a safety net as well, and for this purpose, even the assets are highly rated, they are actually secured by the government to the extent of rupees 10,000 crores. Now, it should be mentioned here that when we are talking about high rated assets, it means the assets which were rated AA or above. These are considered to be highly rated assets which the government has allowed the PSBs to buy from the NBFCs. Now, let us try to understand the changes that have been brought. Now, the first change that the government wants to bring is that not only the assets which are AA or above, but the assets which are triple B plus or above can be bought by the PSBs. So, this is the change number one which the government want to bring to the partial credit guarantee scheme. The second change is also very important to understand. Now, first, let's take the definition of NPAs. Now, whenever we define NPAs, NPAs means non payment of principal or interest for more than 90 days. Now, when we talk about NBFCs, they have multiple type of assets, and some assets are called as incipient assets, which can be considered as assets under stress. It simply means that these are those assets which are under stress. However, they do not come under the category of NPAs. Now, when we talk about these under stress assets, they've been categorized into three broad categories. First, SMA 0 or special mention account 0. Second is SMA 1 or special mention account 1. And third is special mention account 2. Now, as already mentioned, that we are talking about the assets which are under stress. Now, SMA 0 are those assets which haven't turned as NPAs, but the principal or the interest is overdue between 0 to 30 days. If we talk about special mention account 1, it means principal or interest is overdue between 31 to 60 days. And SMA 2 means principal or interest is overdue between 61 to 90 days. So these categories of assets are not NPAs yet, but there are chances that they may be NPA in the future because they are under stress. Now, another change which has been suggested by the government is that partial credit guarantee scheme would cover only those assets which are categorized under SMA 0, which means 0 to 30 days of non payment of principal or interest. At the same time, it clarifies that SMA 1 and SMA 2 will not qualify for partial credit guarantee scheme. So, these are the two broad changes which are being brought by the government. So, this brings us to the last part of the entire discussion, that is the benefits of this partial credit guarantee scheme. First and foremost, this scheme will bring liquidity support to the NBFCs, which can actually in turn work in the favor of economy as such. As already mentioned, this liquidity can fight slowdown in the economy. Last but not the least, this liquidity can also help in giving new leash of life to NBFCs and the way they handle their NPAs. This handling of NPAs is important for our banks as well. So, any kind of problem that disrupts the NBFCs, the banks are also influenced in that bigger scheme. And so, the benefits are primarily three. First, liquidity of NBFCs. Second, it will help in fighting the slowdown in the economy. And third, the related banks can also be saved from this process. So, this is the entire scope of this discussion. We have taken this article from page number 12, and it talks about Lok Sabha passes bill to set up unified authority for financial services in India. Now it is important here to highlight that the Lok Sabha on Wednesday passed the International Financial Services Center, that is IFSC Authority Bill of 2019. And in this context, this article is important for us. Now, as far as international financial centers are concerned, Gujarat International Finance Tech City Company Limited is being developed as country's first international financial center, that is IFSC. So this is something which is important from the perspective of the prelims examination, and you should take a note of this. At the same time, this is important to know that this topic is important from the perspective of economy, and it is important for prelims as well as mains. Now, before going into the understanding of the bill, let's first understand what is an IFSC. Now, when we talk about IFSC, or in other words, International Financial Service Center, it basically caters to the customers outside the jurisdiction of the domestic economy. Now, in a simple example, let's take that there is some businessman from Britain and who has started using IFSC services in India. So, in this case, the person who is coming from Britain is from outside the jurisdiction of the domestic country, or in this case, where the IFSC center is located. So, IFSC center is located in India and the person is from Britain. Now, as far as the centers are concerned, these centers deal with the flow of finance, financial products, and services across borders. Some of the prominent examples of international financial centers are like London, New York, and Singapore. It is also important to note that Mr. Percy Mistry, who earlier worked with World Bank, recommended that Mumbai should become International Financial Center in 2007. However, due to economic slowdown, this project never took off. So this brings us to the second important question. What are the services that IFSC provides? Now let us focus on the kind of services that IFSC can provide. Now we know that in the process of economic development, financial market is a very important and inherent feature. And we need to provide good services to the business and corporates. Now as far as the services for IFSC are concerned, they include fundraising, and this fundraising services can be extended to individuals, corporate houses, or to the government as well. So when we talk about IFSC, this is one of the first thing that is important from the perspective of the services it provides. Second important aspect is that they provide an opportunity for asset and wealth management. We know that Financial companies are expanding their base and they need to manage their global portfolios. And in order to carry out their business smoothly, they require international financial services centers. Next can be global tax management and cross border tax liability optimization. Now, as the businesses expand and they become multi country in nature, they require services which can actually help in tax liability optimization, which provides a business opportunity for financial intermediaries, accountants, and law firms. So, this has an expanded scope. At the same time, there is one more question that is asked about IFSC is that can IFSC be set up in the special economic zone? Now, the correct answer is the SEZ Act of 2005 allows setting up of IFSC in an SEZ. At the same time, there is an approval required from the central government. Now, this last part basically highlights the need for the bill. As mentioned, that SEZ Act of 2005 has the provision that IFSC can be set up in the special economic zone, although the government approval is required, and that brings to the need for the bill. Now we know that Lok Sabha has recently passed IFSC Authority Bill 2019, and in this context, this bill was passed, and this is the point of discussion of this analysis as well. So, the section 18 of the SEZ Act of 2005 provides that central government may approve setting up of the IFSC center in special economic zone. Although it was mentioned that Mr. Mistry has recommended Mumbai to be India's first international financial service center, but in this case, Gujarat International Finance Tech City Company Limited or GIFT will be developed as India's first IFSC center. Now, the second important aspect for the need of the bill is that an international financial service center enables bringing back the financial services and transactions that are currently carried out in offshore financial centers by the Indian corporate entities. Now we know that Indian economy is growing at a fast pace and hence Indian corporate houses required services of these financial centers and they use overseas branch for such services. It is important that India develops its own financial centers so that these services can be provided not only to Indian entrepreneurs but to outsiders as well. Now we know that the Lok Sabha has passed the IFSC Authority Bill 2019. Now it is important to understand why there is a need to follow an IFSC Authority Bill. The reason is very simple to understand. In the current system, there are multiple regulators in the Indian financial market. They include RBI, SEBI, Insurance Regulatory Development Authority, and many more. Since there are multiple authorities involved and hence the regulation is difficult to manage. And hence, in order to handle this problem, IFSC Authority Bill has been passed. Now the last point focuses on the development of financial product and services in international finance services centers requires focused and dedicated regulatory interventions and requires high level of inter-regulatory coordination. Thus, there is a need to establish a unified financial regulator which can enable a world-class regulatory environment to such financial market participations and promote ease of doing business. Now this brings us to the last part of the discussion, and this is about the provision of the bills. Now when we focus on the provision of the bills, we will be focusing on the coverage, the authority that will be constituted, functions of the authority, and last we'll be talking about the funds for the authority. Now the first thing is very clear to us. The bill will apply to all international financial service centers which would be set up under the Special Economic Zone Act of 2005. So this is what the coverage of the bill would be. It will cover all international financial service sectors. Second important aspect is the authority. Now we know that earlier there were multiple authorities like RBI, SEBI, IRDA and many more. Now, when we are talking about the International Financial Service Center Authority, this authority will be appointed by the central government, and there will be 9 members in the authority, which will include first the chairperson. The second group of people will be drawn from one representative from RBI, SEBI, IRDA, and PFRDA. In this fashion, there will be 4 representatives drawn from these 4 regulatory bodies. Third will be Ministry of Finance, which will be sending 2 members. And there will be a search committee which will be sending 2 more members in this system. These members will have a term of 3 years, and this is how the authority will be constituted. Now we are focused on the functions of the authority. The authority will regulate financial products, financial services, and financial institutions which have been previously approved by any appropriate regulator. And we have already discussed these regulators include RBI, SEBI, IRDA, or PFRDA. So this will be the work of the authority. At the same time, central government through notification can give more work to this authority, which relates to again the financial products, financial services, and financial institution. So that is kind of the freedom that central government has. Last but not the least, we are talking about the fund. Any kind of authority can function smoothly if they have the collection of funds as well. The bill sets up International Financial Service Center Authority Fund as well. And in this fund, money will come from grants, fees, charges, or any kind of earnings that the authority does. Now, these funds will be used for salary and remuneration and for the smooth conduct of business at the authority level. So, this will be the purpose of the fund. At the same time, central government may provide grants to the authority for the regulation of the IFSCs. So, these are the basic provisions of the bill. We have taken this article from page number 1, and it talks about an important achievement of Indian Space Research Organization. The title of the article clearly mentions that this is the 50th PSLV launch which carries radar satellite. In this case, we are talking about RISAT 2BR1, which will be used for national security. Now, this topic will be important more from the perspective of the prelims examination and will be covered under science and technology. At the same time, as a subtopic, it will be part of India's space research program. Now let's highlight few important points of this RISAT 2BR1 satellite. Now the first thing is very clear. ISRO has launched India's defense satellite, and this is RISAT 2BR1. Now in the RISAT series, this is the 4th satellite. At the same time, in this launch, 9 commercial satellites are also launched using the PSLV C-48 from the Satish Dhawan Space Center in Sriharikota. Now this is a landmark event for the ISRO, as this is the 50th mission of the PSLV that will be carrying the spy satellite of India to the space. Now the usability of RISAT is multiple in nature. It will enhance India's weather and agriculture capabilities. At the same time, it will help in providing much needed surveillance as well. We know that India is suffering from terrorist activities from all up. We know that India is suffering from terrorist activities across border. And in this case, RISAT 2BR1 will be of great value to secure India's strategic interests. Now there are few important aspects in terms of technical details. The RISAT 2BR1 is a radar imaging Earth observation satellite, and it weighs at around 628 kg. At the same time, through PSLV C-48, this satellite will be placed in the low Earth orbit of 576 km, and it will have an inclination of 37 degree. Now it is important to understand that these low Earth orbit, weight and degree are important from the perspective of the prelims examination. As we have seen, similar questions were asked in the UPSC examination in the previous years. Now it is also important to understand that India has a commercial wing of space research organization which is called as New Space India Limited or NSIL. Now PSLV C-48 is also carrying 9 customer satellites. Out of these 9 satellites, 6 are from the USA, and 1 each from Israel, Italy, and Japan. This satellite is highly advanced and it uses synthetic aperture radar that will help in increasing the surveillance capability. This will give India all weather surveillance capabilities and it can penetrate clouds and observe images on the ground with a ground sampling distance of just 35 centimeters. In this context, it is important to know more about SAR. Now, as already mentioned, that RISAT 2BR1 comes with the advantage of synthetic aperture radar. Now, this will actually increase the surveillance capability of our country. Now, let's try to understand how the system works. Now, in the image which is given here, this image relates to more of a real aperture radar or RAR. In this case, we can see that satellite has pointed on a particular area and this is how the image has been taken. At the same time, when we focus on the SAR or that is synthetic aperture radar, this means that this image is taken at multiple places in the line of flight. It means that if we draw a line from this line of flight, this image is taken from this point as well, then this point as well, and in this fashion, the scope of the image is increased continuously. So, in this form, the real aperture radar and SAR are different in function. It means the image is captured from multiple points, and through these multiple points, the image are then put together to make an image which is much better in resolution and form. So, this is what the real difference is between the RAR format or the real aperture radar and the SAR. So if this is clear to you, then rest of the things will become automatically clear to you. So in this form, a particular space is covered from the satellite from multiple locations. And once the image which is generated after adding all these multiple images are done, this becomes much more clear. At the same time, it has got additional benefit as SAR radar can penetrate the clouds and observe image on the grounds with ground sampling distance of barely 35 centimeter. The simple meaning is if two bodies are away from each other from a distance of 35 centimeter, then this radar can easily decipher these two bodies, and this makes this much better for the purpose of surveillance. Now another benefit of this SAR radar is that SAR is of course data rich and it can complement data from other sources as well. So India has a wide network of satellite like Cartosat and other INSAT series from which this data can also be complemented. And in this fashion, this improves the surveillance capability of this radar. At the same time, once this data is captured and it is processed, then it can be used for the purpose of military as well as for civilian purpose. Now, one of the limitations of the SAR satellites is that they are much more power hungry and have almost just 10% of duty cycle on orbit. Now, this is one of the limitations or the compromise for the SAR satellites. Now, in the case of RISAT 2BR1, the cycle of operation is expected to be 5 years. It is expected that India will come up with SAR satellites which are smaller, and there will be multiple satellites so that imaging can be improved, which can be helpful in agriculture and disaster management and also for the purpose of surveillance.
Now, the first question is framed on the basis of this news that appears on page number 14 under the title Bougainville votes to become world's newest country. Now, in a referendum that was promised after a decade-long civil war, the voters of an autonomous region called Bougainville in Papua New Guinea has voted in favor to become a separate nation. Now, while the referendum is non-binding, the final say is with the Papua New Guinea Parliament, which now decides the fate of Bougainville. Now, in this context, this question reads, recently Bougainville was in news, is trying to separate from which of the following countries? So, the right option is C, Papua New Guinea. Now, coming to the second question, this question is set on the basis of the article that appears on page number 8. Now, this is the first ever survey of butterflies in the Papikonda National Park that is scheduled to take place within February next year. Now, as to some of the facts relating to Papikonda National Park, it is located in Eastern Ghats. The river that flows through Papikonda National Park is Godavari. Besides, the national park is also recognized as an important bird and biodiversity area by BirdLife International in 2016. Now, in this context, this question reads, which of the following national parks is situated in Eastern Ghats? The answer is B, Papikonda National Park. With this, we come to the end of today's discussion. Now let's take up the question for the day.